Hello, and welcome to Beyond Death's Gate, Story 1, The Roadside. Phillip, Morover, as well as his wife Irene and daughter Alice, were on their way home from the movie theater that was just over in the next town. The weather was dark and miserable. The rain flowed down like a tsunami hitting a beach. The only lighting were the car's dim headlights and the occasional strikes of lightning, followed by the booming of thunder. To the left of the car, train tracks that haven't been used in years, in disrepair, never properly managed. To the right, a dense forest at the bottom of a muddy hill. Phillip was having a hard time maneuvering the small car through the terrible weather on the slick road. His wife and daughter were both asleep in the back seat, holding each other. As he was driving, the car's headlights managed to just barely pick up a small metallic item on the road. A railroad spike. A spike that would forever change the fates of Phillip and his family. A spike that came from the tracks that had been abandoned and ignored all those years. A spike that he did not see until it was all too late. As the car reached the spike, the front right tire was punctured, causing Phillip to lose control of the car and yell out as the car launched over the hill towards the woods. The car flipped once before going over the edge of the hill, leading down to the woods, causing the car to pick up speed. The car once again flipping and rolling down rather than across until finally slamming its passenger side into a tree. The sound of the crash was deafening, and the only sound Phillip could let out was a low groan. The tree was pressed against the right side of the car, crushing it and preventing the doors from being opened. Luckily for Phillip, he had nothing more than a couple of bumps and bruises. The airbags and safety belt saved him from most of the damage. However, as he looked back at his wife and daughter, all he could do was look in horror. Broken bodies and shattered glass were all that filled the back seats. He could see gashes and splintered bones all across the bodies of his wife and daughter. No movement was seen from either of them. He called out to both of them, hoping to get a response, knowing that he likely wouldn't.
Honey? Alice?
It was all he could ask, all he could do. He assumed they were both dead. He knew that there was almost no chance of saving them. He knew that his whole world was likely lost. But before he could move any further, he heard a small sound through the noise of the rain.
Phil.
It was his wife Irene, barely alive, using the last of her strength to call out to her husband. The sound of her voice brought a ray of hope to Phillip. He unlatched his seatbelt and called back to her in a voice so filled with fear and sorrow that he wasn't even sure if she would recognize his voice.
Don't worry. I'm going back up the road to find help. Don't move.
He pulled the door handle and used what little strength he had to push it open. With a resentful groan, the door finally opened. Phillip got out, slowly, making his way back up the hill to look for help. He yelled back to the car, hoping his wife and daughter would somehow still be alive and conscious to hear him.
Don't worry, girls. I'll find someone to help us.
Even if his whole life had just shattered before him, he needed to save himself. And maybe, just maybe, there was a chance, a flicker of hope, that his wife and daughter could be saved too. With the rain still pouring down, he finally made his way to the top of the hill, covered from the knees down in mud, completely soaked. He was unsure of which direction to go, as he was still disoriented from the crash, so he decided to follow the trail of destruction the car had left coming down the hill. When he got to the top of the hill, he hadn't even stepped onto the pavement when he saw it, the spike that had ended his world. He approached it and picked it up. There was nothing special about it, no special characters or defining details. The only thing special about it was what it had just done. Phillip dropped to his knees and began to weep.
It should have been me. They didn't deserve this. The crash is all my fault.
After a few minutes of sitting in the rain, a pair of headlights was seen in the distance coming toward him. He forced himself to get to his feet and prepared for the vehicle to approach. He stood in the middle of the road and waved his hands above his head in hopes that the vehicle would stop and the person inside would help him. When the vehicle finally reached him, it stopped mere inches from him, almost hitting Phillip. It was an all-black sedan that looked fairly new. Suddenly, the passenger door opened, and an older voice from inside the car called out.
Are you getting in? Much better in here than out there, wouldn't you say?
Reluctantly, Phillip got into the car and sat down.
Where to?
Phillip thought for a second, and finally, after a moment of thinking, he finally replied,
Hospital. Or police station. I don't really care. Just someplace that can help me.
replied Phillip, to which the stranger said back to him,
All right, but I must say, neither of those places can bring them back.
What? What are you talking about?
asked Phillip as a black mist started to fill the car, causing him to panic as he tried to open the door. But he couldn't, no matter how hard he tried. He eventually passed out. Just a few moments passed, and Phillip woke up sitting at a table across from the stranger. He could only make out the basic features of the person. The only thing he could see was the desk that sat in front of him and the figure across the room. The walls, floor, and ceiling were shrouded in the same black mist that brought him here.
Where am I? Who are you?
He asked. The figure sat in silence for a moment before sliding forward toward the table. Phillip could now see the figure's features. It was an older man, dressed in a sleek black suit. He had no hair and looked quite frail, almost thin enough to be only skin and bone. The man answered in a low, raspy voice.
I am the one who can change your world, Phillip. Make it whole again.
How do you know my name? Who are you? And where am I?
He asked again, much more demanding, standing up to be above the older man.
Let's make a deal.
The older man replied, a slight smile rising on his face.
What kind of deal? What are you talking about? None of this is making sense.
Phillip said, getting back into his chair.
This deal is my way of giving you a choice of life or death. I will give you the chance to save yourself.
Myself? What do you mean?
I can bring them back, you know. All I ask is a favor from you, Phillip.
A favor? Of what? I'm still not sure what's going on.
Without your wife and daughter, you are broken. Nothing but an empty man. Serve me in damnation for however long it takes for your wife and daughter to die a natural death, and I will grant them with life once again. Do we have a deal?
This still doesn't tell me who you are. And what do you mean, serve you?
The man slowly rose out of his chair and finally replied,
Now, Phil, I think you already know who I am.
He held out his frail hand and asked once more,
Do we have a deal?
Phillip took a moment to consider his options. One side of the deal was living his life without his wife or daughter, the other side being a slave to this man for as long as his family lives. He thought for a moment longer, and an image of his wife and daughter crossed his mind at the last second. He knew what he had to do, even if he still wasn't sure of what exactly was happening.
I accept your deal.
Phillip said as he took the man's hand and shook it. The smile on the man's face returned sharper than before.
I'll see you soon, Phillip.
And in a blink, Phillip was back on the road driving his car, the storm still raging on. Was it a daydream? Was he losing his mind? Was he so sleep-deprived from the long hours he'd been taking at work that he was imagining his family dying in a car crash and making deals with strange figures from the fog? Phillip noticed something sitting on the car's dash and looked over. Sitting there was the spike he had seen in his nightmare. He knew then that it had to be real. As he was looking at the spike, a crash of lightning struck the tree off to his right, causing it to fall across the road right in front of the car. He tried to press the brakes, but it was too late. He hit the tree with so much force that a large branch from the fallen tree drove itself through the window and into Phillip. The last thing he saw was the old man standing in the rain, holding an umbrella, watching him with the same sharp smile on his face. In a flash, Phillip woke up, only now he was standing on the outside of the car looking in. He saw his own lifeless body lying in the driver's seat, the branch piercing through his chest, but more importantly, he saw his wife and daughter were alive. They were both thrown forward in the crash and were trying to gain their bearings, not yet realizing what had just happened. From behind him, he heard the man from before.
You coming? You still have to pay your end of the deal, you know.
Reluctantly, Phillip started walking back towards the man, but before he could turn away, he saw it again. The railroad spike, now laying on the ground outside the car. It must have been flung through the shattered window upon the collision. He picked it up and placed it in his pocket as a reminder to himself that this object was what had killed his world before he had made the choice to change it. He stood for a moment and finally walked back to the man who was still standing, watching him in the rain. As he was walking toward the man, he heard the scream of his wife.
No, 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 no!
She had finally found what had happened to her dear husband. He couldn't bear to turn back around, couldn't bear to see the love of his life in such distress, so he kept walking till he reached the man.
You ready?
The man asked.
As ready as I can be,
Replied Phillip, and they continued walking together through the rain, the black mist setting in once again, engulfing them both until they both disappeared altogether. Years later, Phillip Morover was changed. He was one of Death's many disciples, now going by the alias of the Hitchhiker. He still wore the same clothes he had when he had died, a large red stain on his shirt marking the spot the branch had pierced in the crash. The only new thing he wore was a hooded cloth mask, a smile poorly drawn on it to hide the sorrow he felt for leaving his wife and daughter behind. His weapon of choice was the railroad spike he had saved from the crash. The one that had ruined his world, he now used to take the souls of the others in hopes that one day he could see his wife and daughter again. Hello again, and thank you for listening to our first story of Beyond Death's Gate. I'd like to take a moment to recognize our amazing voice actors for this project. Reed Denney, the voice of Phillip Morover, Meagan Suris, the voice of Irene Morover, and Zugheri, the voice of Death, as well as me, the creator of the production, Gage Conrad, writer and narrator for this story. Thank you all once again for watching, and we hope to see you in the next one.